Good evening, everyone. Sorry. Welcome to the David Witten Bell Gallery, and if I can say on behalf of half of my life, happy St. Patrick's Day. Wearing a little bit of green pride. It was somewhat unintentional, but a happy coincidence. And I'm very, very delighted to welcome you to a conversation with artist Gabriel Martinez, who's here with us from Houston, Texas. And before we sort of get into the conversation, I wanted to sort of say a few words of thanks because all of the projects that happen at the Bell Gallery are the result of a whole team of people who work together for a really long time, put in a lot of hours to make what happens here possible. And so I just want to greatly thank my director, Joanne Conklin, for her wisdom and support. Terry Abbott, our steadfast administrator, who makes everything flow smoothly through the university systems. And then our preparation team, Ian Budish, Deshaun Hale, and Kara Blaine, who put in the tough hours to make everything look fantastic and get everything sort of finished. So thank you to our whole team. I've known Gabriel for a few years now. I had the pleasure of getting to know him as part of a series of studio visits that I did across Texas when I had the chance to curate the international residency program for ArtPace in San Antonio. So conversations started there that continue to this day. Mm-hmm. ArtPace is an incredible institution. They help make a lot of new work possible, and Gabriel was one of the 3 artists that I ultimately selected to have a production residency there about 2 years ago. And so the work that we have here today is the result of that residency that Gabriel undertook. So great thanks to ArtPace for originally commissioning and supporting this work by Gabriel. We're going to have a conversation. It's going to be very informal, relaxed. Gabriel's very open if you want to ask questions or interrupt or disagree. So please feel free to do so. And we're going to talk for roughly maybe 45 minutes and then open up to Q&A. So if anyone is formulating burning questions, there'll be an open floor for certain at the end. But a few words about Gabriel. Gabriel was born in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and he works with people. He works with communities within them, throughout them, and often has dedicated his work to revealing the difficult and hidden histories of conflict and social injustice. He's called a lot of places home, more so than Alamogordo, and most significantly, he's spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. and New York, and currently he's based in Houston, Texas. He started out in Texas as an artist in residence at Project Row Houses, and moved on to being a core fellow at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And he now is leading up an experimental art space called Alabama Song, which is in the Museum District in Houston. I'm very happy to say that just this past Monday, he completed a new project at the Menil in Houston as part of their exhibition Holy Barbarians, work called Paratext, which was sort of exploring publication as a platform for propelling sort of discursive dialogue. Upcoming projects for Gabriel include a major show at the Blaffer Museum at the University of Houston, and I just found out that he is going to be artist in residence for Hyde Park in Chicago as part of an exchange between the city of Chicago and Houston, facilitated with Project Row Houses in Houston. So with that, welcome Gabriel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's really cold here. I was in a t-shirt before I left, t-shirt and shorts, so it took a while to get used to. But yeah.
So I guess to kick off, the thing that I think is very clear with the work that you did at ArtPace, the body of work Mountain War Time, is that it's a difficult narrative. It's something that many of us are familiar with, if only for the sensational high points or the dark moments of our country's history. And I guess just as an open prompt, what was it that initially motivated you to want to undertake a project to address the first nuclear detonation in the U.S.?
The work that's on display has actually probably been rumbling around in my head for 15 or 20 years, but it was actually a matter of what not to do, because there's the town Alamogordo and the base that is affiliated with the, which is pictured here, is affiliated with the blast site, is kind of a weapons lab in the desert, this Air Force base. So it was actually a matter of not overdoing it and not addressing all of the space program or Operation Paperclip. They brought Nazis into New Mexico and all over the U.S. Or the drone program. All of this stuff that's happening there was actually a matter of really just focusing on this. And when I got into New Mexico a couple years ago when I was working on this project, Senator Tom Udall was there, and I just coincidentally, it was the 70th anniversary, so he was there when I went back home to Alamogordo. And he was speaking with the downwinders, and it became immediately apparent that none of the other stuff that goes on at the base could be presented really with this stuff, with this information, because it was so sensitive. You know, the other stuff is very crucial and important, but this is something that I'd been working on for decades in my head. None of the work, I never would have known it would have looked like this, because all of this work was born out of the research that I undertook that a couple of years ago.
So you returned to Alamogordo, but you grew up there.
Yeah.
You know, that was a place
Yep.
that you called home initially, and even more so that your family's been there for a number of years.
Yeah.
That autobiographical dimension, and how that like intersects with some of these like difficult moments around the sort of military history of the United States and how present that is in the Southwest. Sort of what was that like growing up amidst these incredibly pointed major research development efforts by the military?
When you're a kid, I mean, it's like the local banks use them as advertisements, because the stealth bombing program was also there in addition to everything else I listed. So you see it in a very normalized way. The high school graduations will have jets buzz them, and the radio station uses the silhouette of the bombers for their like logo stickers and stuff. So it's always kind of present, but never really discussed critically. And about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I started seeing flyers at the library for community meetings. From what I understand, the very beginnings of the Downwinders organizing. Just to explain that the Downwinders in the Tularosa Basin, because there's actually a bunch of very small towns, Alamogordo, La Luz, Tularosa, they're in a, they're all pretty close. They're all in a basin together in this sort of ring of mountains. And God, I forgot where I was going with that. Remind me where I was going. What was I? The Downwinders. Sorry. So no one, the Downwinders in this area. I just call it the Tularosa Basin because there's so many little towns. They're different from all of the other Downwinders in the country in that they're unrecognized by the U.S. government. Other Downwinders, lived near a uranium mine or near a waste facility, and they're recognized. But I think in order to recognize the citizens of New Mexico, you would have to admit that a bomb was detonated in this county that was actually populated. It was kind of believed that it was very unpopulated. It was sparse, and there was few people that lived there, but there was several communities that suffered, afterwards.
So one thing that I started to understand much more pointedly, getting to know you, was about the U.S.'s relationship to New Mexico, and its transition from being more of a territory to being more of a state. Could you say a little bit about that transition, that sort of political transition, and particularly perhaps a little bit on the United States' perspective on New Mexico?
I mean, living in Texas now, it's it's really apparent, I think, that mineral resources and just natural resources were the real reason that New Mexico didn't achieve statehood until 1912. It was a territory with Arizona for a long time, and there was, there's not a lot of water, there's no water tables, so, and there's no oil or other sort of resources. Additionally, it is Puebla, Comanche. It was Indian territory and still is. So I think it was kind of this area that was left alone for a long time, and eventually it became the site for these tests. In my opinion, because of the reservations, there's an Apache Mescalero reservation right here, and the Mexican population, Mexican and Indian population, was probably a factor in why this was chosen for some of these operations.
And so thinking a little more about that, one of the things that you came up with or spoke about through the process with the work was, if you will, like the internal colonization or imperialism within the functioning United States, the decision that it was okay to detonate a nuclear bomb in this community,
Yeah.
as opposed to another community or another part of the country.
Yeah, outside of Boston or.
Right.
Yeah, I think, it continues a colonial narrative that that uranium is from the Congo, is mined in the Congo, was actually hidden in Hell's Kitchen for a long time until they used it for this test, which is like a teaspoon of uranium. But linking that mining it in the Congo to the Apache Mescalero reservation and New Mexico in general, I think is just colonial narrative that kind of intersects in this moment in the New Mexico desert.
So to drive a transition a little bit, you referenced uranium, and which is a expensive or precious resource, broadly defined. Another one is what's just popped up behind us, which is this collection of trinitite that isn't still in your possession?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I can't get rid of it now. The picture is of trinitite. It's actually all of the pieces of trinitite that my grandmother had collected from the blast site. In 1969, or maybe 70, I think it was 69, they opened up the actual ground zero, which you can visit now twice a year. It's very isolated, and there's only two ways in. So you drive about 100 miles into this. There's nothing around you. And the Tularosa Basin was lake beds from the Pleistocene era. So it's like a bowl, it's a basin. So all of this gypsum is like 200 square miles of gypsum that has been deposited there for probably since back then, I don't know. But when the blast detonated, it fused about 75 acres of that silica into this trinitite. So imagine a piece of, obviously not a whole piece, but broken, half an inch thick, that's 75 acres, and also toxic. So in 1969, when they allowed people to come in, they said you could take as much as you wanted, just don't make jewelry and don't give it to the kids. Which, to my grandma's credit, she never gave to me. I asked for these like 10 years ago. But I think being a kid and seeing this Folgers jar with these I had no idea what they were at the time, and being told not to ever touch it or open it, this piece probably started then, thinking back to not being able to open these. It's hard to see from this photo, but they're actually green. It's a green rock, which is like the Incredible Hulk or something. when they opened this and people took it, it was, in my opinion, kind of a public nuclear waste disposal, because slowly these little pieces are going out into the world. Now, of course, you can't take it, and there's signs everywhere. There's people, when you go to the actual ground zero, who are selling trinitite, which is mostly fake. It's really hard to find and smuggle out of ground zero now because everyone took it. My grandmother took it and everybody. This is the jar. So the image out there is the coffee jar full of all of the rocks. And the images out there were produced by, jump in if you, were produced by exposing the trinitite to X-ray film. So they look like Man Ray photograms, but it's actually, it's not photons. It's actually radiation. So when I was doing this, it took about almost 100 attempts to get the ones that are out there. And I would walk across the street to this kind of studio dark corner that they allowed me to do atomic stuff in. And I would take them to this guy who would develop them. No one develops old school X-rays anymore. It's really hard to get the actual chemical development. But I found this guy, and I would bring him every day, and he, to his credit, never questioned what I was doing. He just was like, whatever. But we figured out after a while, because they weren't working, I was in the 60th try or something, and one of the boxes that the X-ray film came in, it had like a band. Each one has a band of exposure and all of that stuff. It was on one of the X-ray prints, which we figured the night before I had carried all of this stuff in one bag across the street, and it exposed all the way through the box, and that's what was slowing them down. But this is all of them at once. The ones that are out there is about a 5-second exposure or less. I just laid them on the table. I touched the paper on there and then moved it. Because before that I was doing them, they were overexposing.
The word exposure is something that's come up a lot in conversation around this work. And on the one hand, of course, you're actually exposing materials, and that's sort of part of the process or the practice for this work. But in parallel to that, there's also this exposure of narrative. And I sort of just want to open a space to sort of, I think actually you had a third way of thinking about exposure too, but like thinking about the role of exposure both from a technical standpoint, and so photographically, but also in terms of the sort of scientific or the health concerns, but then perhaps also the sort of political or advocacy dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. Exposure was a word. Most of my work starts in language or in jokes, or it's always through language and speaking that I develop projects. But I usually keep a few words that I hold on to as kind of guideposts or themes. They don't ever appear in the work as a pun or anything. But I was interested in exposure, and I was using that as this sort of lens because it existed in these different uses. When these tests were happening, of course it was a big secret, and there was a few people who had witnessed the blast who were on trains, for instance, in Albuquerque or much further north, but the light was so bright that everyone thought a comet had hit, or no one would have thought it was an atomic bomb. But there was an article in Chicago that a man who was visiting New Mexico had contacted a paper and was trying to get this little blurb written about what he had seen. And the FBI stopped that. They were actively stopping stories about what they were doing for national security, of course, at the time. But the blast transformed the desert into photo paper, basically. It was photosensitive. It's the same with Japan. Dark fabrics were burned into the city. to the city itself became this, field of photographic paper, like a negative. And so did the desert. Alamogordo has the tightest light restriction laws in the country. Completely unrelated to this, but it was too juicy to pass up. When I found this, I read a law book about the light laws, and it's actually for astronomy. But this light that was brighter than the sun, it's not a coincidence that they were kind of both these bookends. So I was thinking about resisting the photographic archive. I was doing all this research and I was coming across these amazing images, but I don't want to use them. I didn't want to perpetuate that sort of imagery. And I didn't want to picture the victims. So I was thinking through photography and sort of finding the limits of what I could do. And the exposure was kind of, pulling me along.
So sort of building on that, thinking through, I guess, the more overtly like artistic process. So you were doing this research and you're confronting this difficult material and going through sort of a new or experimental process to you. The output, what we have, part of most of what we have on display here, it's if I may say, it's really beautiful. And I mean that the images themselves are sort of alluring. There's satisfying tonality, the abstraction presents some form, but sort of eludes us at the same time. And sort of what I'm pointing towards is this the role of aesthetics, right, and the aestheticization of what is an incredibly difficult moment in our shared history. And were you comfortable with doing that? Is that something that happened just by accident as a result of playing with these materials in the process? Or is it more intentional to sort of deploy aesthetics or beauty?
It was intentional. I am someone who usually resists that as much, but with a subject matter that is so horrific and that was traumatizing to me, doing the research, I reading about Japan has really changed my life. I felt that it was already an ugly enough subject, and I wanted people to be drawn towards this subject matter. Again, back to exposure. And mobilizing desire seemed to be the best way to do that. I think the rocks are beautiful also. I mean, when you see the rocks, they're actually beautiful. It's technically glass, but it's also completely dangerous. Henry is such a beautiful person. I didn't do anything to that. Just great New Mexico light coming in the room while he played the video. Just
in case for those who might not have seen the show, could you say Henry's?
Henry is the guitarist who's in the video. He is a very important figure in this whole story. He witnessed the blast as a kid. He was like 8 years old, and he was helping his dad in the morning. He talks about the story. The story he tells is just beautiful in the way he tells it. But he was a child helping his dad in the morning. His dad worked on the bass, and he witnessed the blast, and he watched the whole cloud. He's very important because his testimony refuted the official story. The army was claiming that the cloud blew one direction, and the direction that it blew was unpopulated, which first of all isn't true, and second, of course, it blew back. The blast, the fallout, was the size of Australia, so all of those claims are kind of moot anyway, but he's very important because he's the first person who really spoke out about the blast. His story is really amazing. It's just a very short video. And then he plays guitar. He's a 2-time cancer survivor, and I think he had, I can't remember the word. It's when your skin cells die. It's like, anyway, let's not go into it. He's a very amazing person, and he plays a 12-string guitar. He's losing his hearing, and 12 strings are really hard to keep in tune. So if you listen, some of the notes are kind of off. But he actually went to school with my grandparents' siblings. So that was how I kind of met him and got invited over and filmed him. Sorry, he plays that guitar. The song that he's playing in the video is one that he's played at the funerals of the Downwinders. It's a bunch of small little communities, but they're all one church towns. Let me put it that way. And he's played at all of these funerals.
One of the things I think is sort of compelling, at least about the body of work here, is how you have these images, the X-rays, if you will, and there's if at least like a scientific conceit that they are a true document or a record of an event or of something. And in parallel to that, you have deployed like a different tactic in terms of documentation, sort of first-person narration, so Henry's story. Mm-hmm. And both of those are sort of happening in parallel. And do you feel that those, if there's opposition in those, if there's a tension between them, is there a kinship?
I think they work in tandem to expose, I'm going to use that word a bunch, these stories. I mean, the X-rays, I should talk about the original X-rays. I'll come back to that. The photos and Henry's video work in tandem through different sort of channels to refute beneficial story or show another angle from it. The X-rays, actually, I explained how I made them, but I came across this story in my research, and I guess weeks after the detonation, Eastman Kodak had hundreds of boxes of X-rays that had been compromised, fogged, and they had an in-house detective who would find out, who had iodine or who was messing up the production. And so this guy worked on this. He had no idea he was looking for atomic stuff. But eventually he found that the paper mill that made the dividers that split up the boxes had atomic radioactive bits of paper, and they had been pressed into these boards. So these little flecks were hot, and when they were put in the boxes, they kind of exposed all of these sheets outwards. And for me, that was all I needed for this. But given the cover-up of some of these stories, the X-rays actually functioned the way they should have, and they documented damage to the body that we wouldn't normally have been aware of. Just as Henry's story is also this documentation that was specifically kept in the dark.
You sort of referenced refutation, and sort of building on that, one of the things that seems to be a thread in your work, not only as an artist, but if I will, sort of also as an organizer or community leader, is one of advocacy. Creating platforms for those to speak, or where necessary to step forward and speak for those who are not afforded a space. And what is your relation? How do you feel the relationship is between art and advocacy, at least insofar as how you approach it?
I think it's the job of the artist to search for a non-indifferent imaging of the world, one that takes into account the suffering of others, that doesn't presume a totalizing view of society. And that kind of opens up, these histories. I also think I think Henry's story is important for me because it undoes some of the official history that is, surrounding this narrative. And I think that's very important.
So think about sort of the biggest frame, sort of where this work points and where it gets to. And one of the reasons I was sort of very excited to work to bring it to Brown is at Brown right now we're just beginning 3 years of focus as part of the Brown Arts Initiative on arts and environment. And the scale of the ecological impact of nuclear power and nuclear detonations is incredibly difficult to comprehend, let alone represent. And one of the things that draws me into this body of work is how much it seems that you've embraced the inability to truthfully represent the literal situation with the ecology around the detonation of the Trinity bomb.
Yeah. I approach this with that being an impossibility for me. That's why I did a lot of research in the, atomic archives and stuff, and I didn't want to use any images. There were a lot of really amazing ones, but at least not the sort of standard kind of images that you see of the detonation, for instance. I didn't want to use that. Yeah.
Can you say more why? Why would you want to avoid?
I think avoid what?
Avoid representing the literal detonation or the specific site.
I think for me it's similar to representing the victims, which I don't want to. My goal is to bring people into it and not to have. I don't know. I think that really actually doesn't help the cause. To show the images, to show the victims, I think what I was kind of working with this is, for me, some of the limitations of art in a social, in an activist sort of way. Like, there are limitations, and I wanted to be aware of those for myself.
One of the things that we just had the privilege to be part of was Tanya Bruguera came and gave the Andy Warhol lecture here at the Visual Art Department, and incredibly numerous dimensions that she explored, but broadly social practice in the arts, and raised really pointed, important questions about, if you will, traditional approaches to art as object or material. Perhaps questions or indictments of certain practices or commercialization or what have you. And knowing you and having worked with you, I feel that there's an alignment with the way that you work with the communities and the people that you are working with. But I find it compelling, the conclusion that you've come to with this body of work, to create what are beautiful objects that are framed and could be, brought into a collection and could circulate in different ways. And how comfortable are you with that?
I'm comfortable with it. A lot of my work doesn't circulate in the gallery system, and it takes on public space, so-called public space, and I kind of refuse. A lot of times I refuse. The documentation is never printed. It's just simply the JPEGs. Without going into the specifics of the projects, it's the sort of specificity of what I'm working on that determines, whether they end up like this, framed objects, or whether they're actions that are documented performative gestures.
And so given that this is sort of not just a situation that you happened upon, it's autobiographical, right? Your grandmother's involved, and it extends beyond your lifetime in that way, the trajectory of this project. And that's something that I'm humbled in trying to think about is when we're confronting incredibly sublime, if you will, right? I mean, sublime almost in like an Edmund Burke way. Something is so grand it terrifies us. It's impossible to comprehend, like a tidal wave or ecological cataclysm. When we're confronting things that we may only, if we're lucky, dimly see the solution of in our lifetime. So I'm thinking about the environment and whatnot. How do you think about this body of work or these people or this process that you've gone through with them? Where does it end? And how does it exist, or what is its legacy after the action or the research, after the work, after the show, and so forth?
I primarily working with the Downwinders, although to be honest, it's a body of work that I probably won't stop working on. I think a lot of the next steps is dealing with, the actual sort of Downwinder legacy. But in terms of the subject matter, I don't know if I'll stop, now that these pieces kind of perpetuated more work and other projects. I think it's important that my biography isn't in this, even though it's a part of it. Henry's biography is the important part for me. His testimony. I wanted these to be the objects without me in them as much as possible. Yeah, I think that was a part of the challenge, though, is kind of not writing yourself out, but not being, in the center of it. Yeah.
And so I guess looking forward, because one of the things that I always enjoy is being able to talk with artists about new projects. Having gone through the residency at ArtPace, this is one of ArtPace's gallery production studios, so the artists work in the space like this, and then subsequently they make work and the work is exhibited within it. Having gone through that and had the opportunity to sort of step outside of the leadership of Alabama Song and the community work that you do to explore the making of art objects, explore the gallery platform for a moment. How is that impacting what you are looking towards, or even your experience at the Menil recently, which is incredibly, it's a different platform to ArtPace for sure, and certainly is a different platform to Alabama Song or Project Row Houses. Like, what is drawing you to platforms like the Menil or the Blaffer?
The Menil was a little different because we were programming stuff, so it was more performance-based. The Menil was, it's like the best museum in Houston, but I wanted to work with them, because it's a free museum. They are really amazing, and they are recognized in the city. That was like a sort of plugging into an amplifier for us. The Blaffer is more like a traditional art show, which I make objects all the time, but I give them away or they're left in the street. So making objects and circulating them is nothing new for me, but circulating them in a different sort of like a gallery system is not new, but it's something I do much rarer. So the residencies are actually a big part of my production. I get a lot of work made and and exhibited through residencies. But I don't think that's what you were asking. I don't know if I answered that question.
You skirted it a little bit.
Yeah.
But I guess
Not-
maybe to
I
come at
didn't
it in a
mean to.
different way, maybe in a perhaps more like supportive or positive way. In the work that you did at ArtPace, and this body of work, you talked a lot about reaching for poiesis, I think is the word that you use, like so the poetics, poetry, and in confronting such a difficult or horrible situation, such an ugly truth, if you will. And it seems like there's potential there, or at least you've found that, at least in how this body of work has propelled you in this moment, how it's circulating. What do you see as the role of poetry or beauty, aesthetics, what have you, within for you, the more traditional projects, which are more socially engaged? They're place-based, they're responsive, working with people, working with community. What's that relationship for you?
I think the poiesis is across both for me. And in the moments where I'm in the street and I'm working in shared environments, I'm looking for the poetic, even more so. But the work is much more didactic than these. With these, I think they're hidden, they're camouflaged in a poetic and an aesthetic. In a poetic, let's just use that. Let's just make that word up. But they're actually very didactic. You know, the X-ray images are. It's a representation of radiation, which is not a poetic representation. You know what I mean? And Henry's story is very much like a bearing witness, a testimony. It sounds like just someone talking. He never mentions the atomic bomb. And it is the truth, but it's a different type of truth, you know, than radiation exposed to X-rays. So poiesis kind of runs through my work, or I try to whenever I can. And with these, I was very interested in that camouflaging or passing. You know, their passing is like mid-century or early, you know, kind of modernist photographs, you know, Man Rays and stuff. But yeah, but they're not. So the poetic part, this beauty that you see, is actually kind of a false thing. I do think that it's, for me, it was the only way I could represent this subject matter. Not taking the route of showing, of visualizing the trauma. So I think that's where the poetics was. I was searching, you know, using that as a lens.
And so I guess pick up on lens and sort of cycle back through the work to sort of sum us up a little bit. One of the things that you were experimenting with in parallel to the X-rays was sort of metaphorical language with glass. And so what we see here is some of the, I mean, they were realized works in the context of ArtPace, but were sort of, you know, an experiment with the possibility of glass beyond the literal trinitite. Could you say a little bit more about the context of how this relates, both in terms of sort of the aesthetic exploration and the material exploration, but also the historical dimension of this body of material?
I think your first question was, you know, when we first sat down, what was it? Something like, what was I thinking about with this piece? And all three of these pieces, the ArtPace show had 3 suites, and there's 3 glass pieces, and then the rest is out there. All 3 of them came from the research that I was doing, you know, at this time. But with these, like I said, I was looking through the archives, and I was trying to decide how I could use the archive without using the images. And I realized that everything that I was looking at was in like 2 or 3 aspect ratios, 3 or 4. And I started thinking about that architectonic, of the information age, that an aspect ratio of a different camera lens, whether it's films or still photography, is kind of like the brick of the information age. And these are all aspect ratios that were found in the archive. So each of the pieces of glass is technically a photo from the archive that I refused the image of. The scientists, so when they did the blast, there was 3 camera points set up 10,000 feet from the blast site. And the scientists were in one of those 3, they were at different ones. They watched the blast through welding glass, tinted glass. That was the only protection they had. And they would have been blinded. Actually, I think Richard Feynman was blinded because he looked at the blast and was temporarily blinded. So I was thinking about the glass as this sort of protective thing, the archive as this sort of almost protection, depending on who's tending it, and the photograph also as these sort of distancing devices. And I wanted them to look like Albers, for instance, like this one here, I think, or some of the early color experiments.
So maybe to sort of sum up and open up to questions, but before we sort of release you from being on the floor, could you say a little bit about just where the Downwinder community is sort of today, the actual nuts and bolts of how things have been?
They're still, there's not a single vote right now. So it's an uphill battle. It probably won't happen in their lifetime.
What will happen?
Them being recognized by the National Energy Commission, actually getting Downwinder status and protection. A lot of the generation is already dead, and it's the next generation that actually suffered much, much more because because it's in a basin, all the water from the mountains ran into this area where the towns are, and everyone had cisterns. It was the 40s, so and it's New Mexico, so you have to gather all the water you can. All of that water went into the cisterns. All of the grass and mesquite and stuff. They hunted and ate rabbits. The rabbits ate the grass. So it was this kind of perfect storm of environmental disaster. And it basically is still there today. Remind me again what you
just to let us know sort of how the community is today, and if you felt like.
Okay, so sorry, yeah. A lot of the next generation of like my dad's age are the group that suffered the most because they were exposed. They were born after the blast, but they were exposed their entire lives to a long sort of slow exposure. Tom Udall from New Mexico is right now the only senator who's actually pushing for that. So it's an uphill battle.
And what would it mean if they achieved Downwinder status?
I think there is a monetary compensation, but when I interviewed people, almost all of them said they were not interested in that, and that they wanted to be recognized as suffering for the country during wartime. The title is called Mountain Wartime because when the bomb was blasted, the nation was under wartime, so it's mountain instead of mountain savings time. It was mountain wartime. So for me, that time really kind of located the war at home, the colonialism at home, because it's a U.S. time zone that's at war. And the time was really important. I think the geological formations and the uranium coming from a supernova 5 billion years ago. I wanted to, also Smithson, I was thinking about Smithson, so I was thinking about deep time and geologic time and exposure. Radiation is not just how close, but it's how long you're exposed. So when the soldiers were doing this, doing the tests and stuff, they stopped them at 5 Roentgens per day, which by 1986, it is changed to 5 per year, and it's probably less now. So, yeah, the community was really affected, but just because it was the patriotism, the end of the war, all of this stuff, is just kind of lost. A lot of Japanese news outlets and organizations visit Alamogordo and interview all these people. And it's the first time I read about Henry was through a Japanese publication. The one last thing, since I was reminded of it, the Army sent out pieces of film. This is why I was thinking about photography for this. In, I forget, registered mail, or I forgot what the term is, but they sent it to like 140 communities in New Mexico, southern New Mexico. And no one picked them up, so they were sent back to the scientists. And then they took those, and that was the extent of their testing for radiation to the different towns, which of course is completely ineffective. But photography played a big role in protecting the soldiers,
Well, with that, thank you, Gabriel. I'd like to open it to the floor if anyone has any questions. And if I may say, Gabriel is a bit of a font of wisdom in terms to the Downwinder community. And so if anyone's more interested in the specifics of that actual campaign for recognition, we could speak to that. But does anyone have any thoughts or reflections or prompts or worries?
I have a couple of questions. Talked about, I guess, victimization and not seeing the exhibit yet. You don't focus on the downwinders, except with Henry? You didn't want to focus on the people that were harmed?
I didn't want to photograph them.
Because
I did.
The victimization
yes.
idea?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's
And
yeah.
is this a cathartic for you to
work
as your
on?
family has lived through this?
It really has been. I think, like I was saying before, it's something that I had been thinking about for forever, my whole life, but it just couldn't do it. There's too many things that are going on in this town that, kind of pulled me in different directions, and in terms of subject matter for art projects. So finally getting involved and working on it was actually really gratifying. That's why I will continue, to work with it.
Is this on? Yes. Simple question. What year did this explosion take place?
1945, it was 2 weeks before Japan.
Okay.
So, they didn't know what was going to happen. The scientists, no one had any idea. So they had a New York Times reporter, the only reporter that was there. He wrote 3 little articles that were different depending on what would happen. And the first was like, it failed. The second one was major damage, it was a success, and it blew all this stuff up. And the third was their obituaries, including his own. They had no
Okay,
idea.
second question. Has your project led to any government research or follow-up on the health of the next generation that is living now?
Not at all. I wish I could say that it has, but in reality, I hope that it does. It's not really at the channels of circulation yet that people would be exposed to it, but the Tularosa Basin downwinders actually are much more recognized in terms of governmental recognition and assistance.
And where can we see the video?
It's right out here, but you know it has a pause in it. So if it looks like it's turned off, it's this kind of delay. So it will pop up.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, of course, thank you.
Terry.
Knowing the damage that this has done, has there been any consideration or any, how can I put it, thoughts in reference to nuclear? Because nuclear goes to a whole nother level, and now with nuclear weapons in different countries experimenting and building nuclear warheads, and they have to test it somewhere, the effects of that and what happens to the people. Is there any type of organization or any awareness saying, well, this was something that was small and see what happened. Now you're going to another level. What do you think is going to happen to the people that live in the area when you do this testing?
I think it's really timely, especially with, with everything going on. Just leave it at that. Pierre Huyg's show is actually really important for that with the Fukushima. Atmospheric testing stopped in 1963, thankfully. So I hope we never have to deal with that again. But it's kind of hard to curtail, countries like North Korea or, anywhere really. The nuclear resistance in the 80s actually really was an effective deterrent. So I think that there hasn't been anything that's been that unifying. It hasn't been that big of a base of people. So I hope that, most importantly, I hope that the Tularosa Basin downwinders get recognized, because I do think that in a national stage, I think that will garner or open up a conversation about nuclear terror. I hope so.
Oh, yeah.
I had a question. This is coming from an artist's perspective. Your work the photographs are very minimalistic and quite beautiful, and I was wondering how can a viewer really understand the work and really get deep into how it all.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a challenge for artists. For myself, I have a term which I thought I made up called paratext, and paratext is actually all of the parts of a book that isn't the central text, the actual story. They can either obscure the main text, but most likely they enunciate, all of the footnotes, all of the index, and all of these references within a book. So I used the term, and I still use the term paratext, to speak about those elements of the work. And for me, that it's a liberating thing, for one, because I know that the images are never enough. And images of them, that was one of the reasons why I resisted that. For me, the image is always tethered to the text, and it's in some of my other work that's not really apparent from these pieces. Those dimensions are elevated to the sort of same level as the object or the performative elements that produce the object. But really, with the sort of forms of circulating images now, it's easier now than ever. Like when I first started, I was still taking slides of work, you know. So with a website and just, you know, all of the things available, I feel that it's actually kind of liberating to make the work as a part. So those pieces I consider just one fragment of the actual artwork. And for me, that's it's very liberating, because if I need to, I can go back and put more of that, make that more apparent in the pieces.
They obviously knew there was going to be fallout after this blast. Were the downwinders part of the test to see the effect on
It's a great
people?
question, because in my nightmares, the answer is yes. But in all of my research, of course, there's no proof of that. But to be honest, it was the late 20s, so not even 20 years before this, that the dangers of radioactivity were discovered. And it was women who painted clocks with radium paint, which glows in the dark. So I don't really think that they were thinking about that as, you know, however, with Japan, those cities that were on the target list were not bombed. They weren't firebombed, or traditional bombing, a horrible term. But so they preserved those Japanese cities so that they could observe from the air, through cameras, the damage. So while I hope that that's not the case, I do think that it's not a coincidence that it's this kind of pocket of the U.S. that was kind of forgotten, and, you know.
Any last question before we?
But just one last thing, the soldiers were absolutely used that way. And later on, with some of the other tests, even not atomic, but the nuclear tests, the soldiers would go out with a little piece of film on their breast pocket, and that was the extent of, they would pull them back in. So the soldiers were absolutely a part of that, but hopefully the civilians weren't.
Well, on behalf of us here this evening, I thank you, Gabriel, for taking time and walking us through this really important body of work.
Thank you. Thank everyone.
And please join us in the lobby for drinks and refreshment, and please take in Pierre Huyg's Untitled Human Mass, which is on display in the main gallery. Thanks so much.